Today we will experience one day in the life of a real Egyptian pharaoh. This is an unusual event, since we usually talk about the daily life of simple hard workers, but diversity is always welcome, especially when it comes to the fascinating history of ancient Egypt. However, we note in advance that from the point of view of the pharaohs, our guest will seem ordinary, inconspicuous, and, one might say, unhappy. Unfortunately, everything related to ancient Egypt begins with the prefix perhaps. Even scholars with all their scientific degrees find it difficult to be sure about predictions related to the history of Egypt. The reason for this is obvious. Just think, for the ancient Romans, ancient Egypt was older than the ancient Romans are for us today. The legendary Cleopatra lived closer to the first flight of man into space than to the time of the construction of the Great Pyramids. Her birth took place in 1969 BC, and Gagarin's flight took place in 1961. At the same time, the Pyramid of Cheops was built in 2540 BC, 2,470 years before the birth of Cleopatra. The Pyramids of Cheops, in fact, represent only the beginning of the history of Egypt. The first state formations in this territory appeared 1,000 years earlier, in 3500 BC, and the last records in Egyptian hieroglyphs were made in 308. In order to understand the analogy, one must cite as an example the longevity of the modern United States in comparison with ancient Egypt. To achieve the same historical longevity as ancient Egypt, the modern United States will need about 3,556 more years. That's a good number, isn't it? Therefore, when studying any materials about ancient Egypt, one should be careful, since only 10% of the records of this era have been found, and of those that have been found, only a part has been deciphered. However, we have tried to select facts on which historians agree in order to introduce you to Pharaoh Tutankhamun, whose day we will spend in his shoes. This takes place sometime around 1324 AD. When Egypt is in a period known as the New Kingdom. At the moment we are talking about, civilization is already 2,000 years old, and it is at the peak of its development. Our Tutankhamun rules Upper and Lower Egypt. He is only 18 years old, but for the pharaohs, youth is not a hindrance. Tutankhamun ascended the throne at the age of 10, and after only 3 years he is already making very conscious political decisions, albeit with the help of servants. Let's define scope first. We have not just mentioned Upper and Lower Egypt. For almost the entire history of Egypt, Lower and Upper Egypt were informally or officially separated. Lower Egypt is a more favorable land, located in the valley of the Nile River, next to the Mediterranean Sea. In turn, Upper Egypt is lower and mostly concentrated right on the banks of the river. As you understand, moving away from the Nile a few kilometers into Africa, you will meet the desert. And yes, you read that right. Upper Egypt is indeed lower than Lower Egypt. One way or another, about 6,000 years ago, the inhabitants of Upper Egypt faced the desertification of the savanna as a result of climate change, and they had to take drastic measures to survive. Scholars are inclined to believe that in the end the king of Upper Egypt, known as the King of the Scorpions, conquered Lower Egypt, uniting both regions into one state with varying degrees of success. Since then, Egypt has existed as a single entity and is under the control of our Tutankhamun. The embodiment of this is Karen Absinthe, which symbolizes the union of two crowns, a red crown representing Lower Egypt and a white crown symbolizing Upper Egypt. Often in reliefs and drawings, the pharaoh was depicted between two goddesses, each of whom gave him her own crown. For the ancient Egyptians, the pharaoh was not just a representative of the gods, he was their guide and saint. Each Egyptian was obliged to give all his resources to the pharaoh, because they believed that the richer and more beautiful the pharaoh, the richer and more beautiful every inhabitant of Egypt would become. It may not have happened during the current life, but it will definitely happen in the afterlife. Therefore, every day of the pharaoh's life was full of ceremonies. As soon as our Tutankhamun opened his eyes, His entourage immediately played special music, symbolizing the rising sun, to the delight of the whole environment. Special ministers organized a bath with rose water for the pharaoh in the presence of his family and associates. The pharaoh was put on makeup, looked after his hair, and picked up a wig. Indeed, with the exception of a short beard, many pharaohs, including our Tutankhamun, shaved their heads and used luxurious wigs with decorations. Being the personification of wealth, the pharaohs possessed a lot of precious jewelry. Tutankhamun was like a walking piece of gold, dominated by gold and precious stones. Then he went to the chapel of Osiris, where he performed prayers, used incense, and washed the statue of the god. When leaving the temple, Tutankhamun left the doors open so that grace spread throughout Egypt, and he personally appointed priests. The temple of Osiris played an extremely important role. After a sumptuous breakfast in the dining room, where food was served not only to the pharaoh, but also to the statues of his ancestors in the dynasty, Tutankhamun got to work, and this is the most interesting aspect. Despite all the religiosity and worship of the pharaoh, ancient Egypt was a very flexible state with a developed system of government. The pharaoh had a vizier, his personal advisor, who helped him make decisions on work matters. In addition, he had a whole cabinet of ministers, treasurers, judges, police chiefs, and other officials. All of them kneeled before Tutankhamun, and after a hearty breakfast, the pharaoh deserved reports. However, one should not idealize the situation, as a significant part of the kneeling ministers plotted intrigues, embezzled their own affairs, and stole. The power of the pharaoh was absolute, but it was impossible for one person to cope with all this. Much of the success of a pharaoh's reign depended on the quality of his chosen advisors. The father of our Tutankhamun, Akhenaten, made the mistake of recruiting inexperienced and incompetent advisors and tried to carry out a religious revolution, replacing the main god Amun with Aten, which did not please the people. Our Tutankhamun, since his birth, was called Tut, which translates as the living embodiment of the Aten. However, after becoming pharaoh, he changed his policy and returned to the classical approach, which gave power to Egypt. Amun-Ra, the god of air and sun, became the supreme god again, and his temples were reopened, while the inhabitants received funding. It was these decrees that Tutankhamun issued at morning meetings. In addition to this, great attention was paid to trade. Egypt, like many states of that time, was mainly an agricultural state. However, the distinguishing feature was the maximum use of the Nile River. The Egyptians built canals and developed irrigation systems, which allowed them to provide a rich harvest. They traded with neighboring states such as Babylon, Assyria, southern African states, as well as northern Greek neighbors across the Mediterranean. Our Tutankhamun even once visited Crete as part of a small visit. Thanks to the favorable location of Egypt, the Egyptians traded in black slaves, ivory, and other goods from South Africa. They perfectly mastered the art of navigation, especially during the period of the New Kingdom. It was convenient for them to deliver goods along the Nile River, which made this era the most powerful period in the history of the Egyptian Empire. However, Tutankhamun's father, Akhenaten, with the help of inexperienced advisors, managed to destroy the army and lose Syria. Tutankhamun is thinking about the possibility of restoring military power and striking back at the Hittites, but it is still too early for that. This task would later be carried out by Ramses II. In ancient Egypt, there were no traditional barracks. The army was simply formed and placed in dangerous directions. Ensuring order within the country was carried out by police officers who were either recruited from conquered tribes or hired. By the way, in addition to bows, swords, war chariots, and spearmen were often found in the army of ancient Egypt during the time of Tutankhamun. However, no one fought on the battlefield anymore. As for the day of the pharaoh, after exhausting meetings, he went to rest. It was believed that during the rest, the dreams of the pharaoh could be prophetic. Therefore, next to him were advisors who immediately wrote down the dreams and decrees of Tutankhamun. When there were no dreams, the pharaoh continued to issue instructions. They mainly concerned the construction of new temples, the creation of statues of ancestors and other archaeological sites. And after the rest, the pharaohs add in a stretcher. The stretcher was usually used by the personal guards to carry our Tutankhamun during his walks. During such walks, the pharaoh went out onto the terrace and addressed blessings to all 4 cardinal points. This blessing was accompanied by the sound of trumpets, and all who heard it, like dominoes, raised flags, fell to their knees and prayed. It was believed that being at this moment was a happy event, a kind of ticket. There are cases when thieves and murderers claimed that they were carried out during the blessing of the pharaoh, and in such cases the court decision was softened. It was forbidden even to beat animals during the blessed moment, and there could even be a death penalty for such a violation. Tutankhamun's life was sacred, and touching the pharaoh was considered the equivalent of a ticket to life. Sometimes, very rarely, while walking or relaxing in the garden, the pharaoh could invite a child or an adult to him. If at this moment Tutankhamun touched someone, rumors of such an event would instantly spread. The opportunity to be touched by the pharaoh could turn a person into a respected official, an honorary person, or even a priest. After all, it was believed that the pharaoh never makes mistakes. By evening, the pharaoh usually returned to the dining room, where he again retained the presence of statues of gods and ancestors. The food was literally laid out in front of him with stone tablets, and probably left for special people to eat later, since the leftovers after eating, supposedly half-eaten by the gods and previous pharaohs, were transferred to the courtiers. In addition to all this, the pharaohs also entertained themselves with dances, women, and circus acts. Then, at the end of the day, Tutankhamun returned to the temple of Osiris, where he confirmed the bows left by the priests in the morning and put the god to sleep. The doors were sealed until the next morning, and our pharaoh went to his bedroom, where a little volatility awaited him. Usually his daily routine was monotonous, with the exception of possible trips. The pharaohs often changed the capital like clockwork. Akhenaten founded the city, calling it a Hittiten, the capital. Our Tutankhamun was also born there, but after he became pharaoh, he moved to Memphis and declared it the new capital. However, at that time the capitals could be called differently, and the Thebes cities, which Tutankhamun visited quite often, were considered the center of Upper Egypt. This is explained by the fact that his patron was the god Omen, whose name our pharaoh bore. In fact, not far from Thebes, in a place known as the Valley of the Kings, Tutankhamun ordered the construction of his sanctuary, which became his tomb. For the pharaohs, this was commonplace, but the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 was a real sensation. Its contents turned out to be practically untouched, and the golden mask found inside became a symbol of Egypt and is known to almost everyone. However, many historians argue that the only memorable event associated with Tutankhamun is his life and death, since this pharaoh was very ordinary. His descendant Ramses conquered Syria, and his ancestor Hatshepsut conquered half of Asia and significantly transformed the country. Tutankhamun was a humble pharaoh, and the most significant aspect of his reign is his tomb. If you are interested in more videos about ancient Egypt, don't forget to like. We would love to build pyramids and study the life of slaves. Until we meet again, friends.